Imagine it's the middle of the night. Someone you love calls you and wakes you up from a sound sleep. You're jarred at first, but quickly relax once you realize the person is okay. They just need a little help. You might be slightly annoyed, but overall relieved that the circumstances are not as dire as you may have imagined when you first heard the phone ring. So you pull yourself up and you make your way out into the dark of night to help your loved one. But then, what you thought would be a quick trip turns into an hour-long search, an unsettling exclamation over the phone, and an uncovering of surprising clues, revealing that things were not as they seemed. And suddenly, what started out as a minor inconvenience spirals into a 16-year-long mystery. This is the story of the haunting disappearance of Brandon Swanson. Brandon Victor Swanson was born on January 30th, 1989 in Marshall, a city in the southwestern part of Minnesota in Lyon County. In 2008, Brandon was 19 years old. On May 13th of that year, Brandon met up with his friends to celebrate the end of the school year. He had just completed his first year at Minnesota West Community and Technical College in Canby. He had been studying wind turbines and was very interested in science. He had plans of transferring to a 4-year university. It was around the town of Canby that Brandon attended a few parties that night. While he was seen drinking, others that saw Brandon that night claimed he was not obviously impaired. It was just before midnight when Brandon set off in his Chevrolet Lumina to make the approximately 30-mile drive home from Canby to Marshall. Despite the two towns being connected via Highway 68, essentially making the journey home for Brandon a straight shot, he opted instead to take several back roads. It's not known why he decided to do this, but some have speculated it was to avoid police. Brandon had previously gotten a DUI, and it's been theorized that he decided to travel via a series of back roads to avoid detection, given that he had been drinking. Unfortunately, this decision would be the first in a series of events that would lead to confusion, frustration, and ultimately tragedy. It was 12:30 a.m. on May 14th when the phone rang out at the home of Brandon's parents, Brian and Annette Swanson. Fortunately, Brandon was unharmed, but he told his parents he'd accidentally driven his car into a ditch and needed them to come pick him up. This was after several attempts to contact his friends were unsuccessful. Brandon described his location to his parents, a rural road outside of the town of Lind. Lind is a small town about 10 miles away from Marshall, where Brandon and his parents lived. He stated he was on the left side of the road, just off of Highway 23. Keeping Brandon on the phone, his parents jumped into their pickup truck and made their way southwest toward the town of Lind and to the location that Brian described on the phone. Regrettably, when Brian and Annette arrived at the location described to them, they could not find their son. Brandon's father would later state that Brandon did not seem impaired and that he had his wits about him. He also said that Brandon was adamant about where he was. Frustration mounted as time ticked on and they were unable to find each other in the pitch-black night in rural Minnesota. Apparently, things got exasperating enough that Brandon hung up the phone on his parents at one point. At 2:17 a.m., Brandon's mom called him back and apologized, but they just couldn't see him. They try a new approach. They would each flash the lights on their respective vehicles in hopes that one of the other parties would be able to see the lights. But this was to no avail. Eventually, Brandon, frustration ramping back up, says he sees lights in the distance, the town of Lind. He tells his parents he's going to start walking towards the town, and his father agrees that the two will meet at the Linwood Tavern. It's at this time Brian decides to drive his wife Annette home before eventually going back out to search for Brandon. Brandon and his father begin what would be their final phone call. Brandon, who had been following a gravel road up until this point, decides to cut through fields and farmland, figuring it would be quicker He tells his dad that he hears running water nearby and expresses his frustration at encountering various fence lines. All of a sudden, and 47 minutes into the call, Brandon suddenly exclaimed, "Oh shit!" After this, Brandon stopped responding to his parents. A common misconception in this case is that after uttering the expletive, the call dropped. But according to an interview conducted with Annette Swanson, Brandon's mother, on HLN, it was Brian's father that ended up disconnecting the call. Confused about what happened, his father kept calling out his name, but to no avail. After a few minutes, he decided to disconnect the call, thinking that maybe even if the ringer wasn't on, hopefully the phone would light up, allowing Brandon to locate it more quickly. Still, the calls went unanswered. Brandon's father decides to call Brandon's friends to come help with the search. Together, they comb the rural roads outside of Lynn searching for Brandon or his car. Finally, hours go by without any sign of Brandon. And as the sun came up over southwestern Minnesota, his mother Annette calls the Lyon County Sheriff's Office. The initial response from the police was frustrating, to say the least. They suggested that plenty of college kids fail to come home after a night out with friends, and besides, Brandon was 19 years old, a legal adult, and therefore he, quote, had a right to be missing. This is all in spite of the fact that Brandon called his parents for help and was heard uttering an expletive over the phone before he stopped responding to calls completely. Despite the resistance initially received from the police, they do move quickly on obtaining Brandon's cell phone records, and it would be this discovery that would change everything. To everyone's surprise, the cell phone records revealed that Brandon's phone pinged off a tower in Minnesota, over 20 miles away from where Brandon claimed he was when he was on the phone with his parents. Armed with this new information, police were able to refocus their search, and at 12:30 p.m. on May 14th, they discovered Brandon's car. Brandon's Chevy Lumina was located in a ditch off a gravel road, approximately 1 mile north of the intersection of Lyon-Lincoln County Road and Highway 68. While there was minimal damage to the vehicle, it was clear that the car was stuck. The discovery of Brandon's car answered one question, and one question only: why his parents couldn't locate him the previous night. He was over 25 miles away from where he thought he was. But how could he have been so confused? There are a few potential contributing factors. The roads in this part of rural Minnesota are set up in a gridlock system, where a lot of street names are actually numbers. For example, 370th Street. To give you a sense of just how rural this area is, some of the roads are gravel or farm service roads. In addition, with expansive farmland in all directions, there are no streetlights. In the darkness of night, in the middle of nothing but fields, it's easy to see why one might get turned around. Furthermore, we do know that Brandon had consumed at least some alcohol that night. Reports vary, but some saw him drinking beer, with one account saying he had a shot of whiskey. On top of it all, simple sleepiness or fatigue could have also played a role. Strangely enough, Brandon's glasses were found in the car, but he was legally blind in one eye. Why did he take his glasses off? And where did he go? What happened to him? And most disturbingly, what caused him to yell out, "Oh shit"? Thankfully, we're able to piece together some clues based on Brandon's father, Brian's conversation with him that night. They spent a lot of time on the phone together as Brandon described what he was doing and the direction he was going. He had also remarked that he encountered 2 fence lines, which frustrated him as he had to hop over them. He also said he could hear running water nearby. Search dogs were deployed in the area, and one of the dogs was able to follow Brandon's scent from his vehicle, which aligned with his dad's account of what Brandon was describing. The dog followed Brandon's scent from his vehicle, traveling a half-mile south before turning west onto 390th Street. The dog then continued west for a mile. Then, the trail turned north onto County Road 16, where it continued for another half-mile. From there, the dog turned west onto the driveway of an abandoned farm. It continued for a quarter of a mile, at which point it left the driveway, following the course of the Yellow Medicine River, heading northwest. Alarmingly, at one point the dog actually jumped into the river, but then jumped back out and continued the path. From the river, the dog continued north towards a gravel road at the boundary between Lincoln and Yellow Medicine counties, at which point the scent was lost. An obvious theory given the path taken by the search dogs is that Brandon fell into the Yellow Medicine River. Is this what caused him to swear? Did he drown? One particular investigator, Sheriff Jack Visecki, walked the path of the river, 2 miles or 3.2 kilometers, every day for 30 days after Brandon disappeared. Yet no sign of him turned up. Not a piece of clothing, not his phone, nothing. So investigators became skeptical that Brandon drowned. Some describe the Yellow Medicine River being more as creek-like in the area, although it could rise up as high as 10 feet in some places. Still, the fact that Brandon's remains have never washed up despite several searches raises the possibility that something else happened to him that night. But what? Given the fact that one of the search dogs jumped into the river before getting out and continuing on a path, some theorized that perhaps Brandon did fall into the river, but made his way out after the fact. The temperature in the area on the night of Brandon's disappearance was as low as 39 degrees Fahrenheit. According to the Charlie Project, a website that documents thousands of missing persons cases throughout the United States, Brandon was wearing a t-shirt under a polo sweatshirt and blue jeans on the night that he vanished. Hardly warm enough attire for the weather. If Brandon fell into the river, it's possible he suffered from hypothermia and succumbed to the elements after getting out. He could have sought shelter from the cold and passed away. The only question at that point, where is his body? And that question has brought up another disturbing possibility. During one of the many searches for Brandon, his scent was picked up by search dogs on a piece of farm equipment. Some theorized that Brandon could have been accidentally run over by the machinery. Perhaps he passed out and an oblivious farmer ran over him without noticing. While it sounds far-fetched, there have been reported incidents of such a thing occurring. However, none where the person went missing afterwards. It's a grisly possibility, but it's also possible that the farm equipment had Brandon's scent on it simply because Brandon had walked through the area shortly before the machine was used. Whatever the reason, we likely may never know. In order to search a great deal of land in the area Brandon went missing, authorities would have had to get permission from landowners, as much of it was private property. Many of these landowners flat out refused to allow police or search dogs on their property. This was due to planting and harvesting season. Essentially, police had to rely on these individuals to check their own properties and report any suspicious findings accordingly. It's worth noting that one of these landowners who would not allow a search of their property was also the owner of farm equipment in question. The reasoning behind this particular landowner's decision could very well be anything but ominous. After all, they have no obligation to allow searches on their property, especially if it would interfere with their livelihood. But what if Brandon did encounter a stranger out there in the dead of night? Another theory that's been raised in this case is the possibility that Brandon found himself on private property unbeknownst to him, perhaps encountering a landowner that was less than thrilled to see a stranger. After all, in the dead of night, it's tough to determine why anyone would be on your land that you didn't recognize. Did Brandon get into a confrontation with an angry property owner who may have acted too soon if he or she perceived what they thought to be a threat? Was the "oh shit" Brandon was heard saying because he saw a person that startled him? If there was no one else out there with Brandon that night, another possibility is that Brandon fell into an old well or cistern. At least that's the theory that's been raised. While this would explain why Brandon's body has never been located, potentially, it's also unlikely in the eyes of some. Residential cisterns or wells are generally about 4 to 6 feet in diameter, which would not allow a human to get stuck in. Additionally, according to Minnesota state law, cisterns and wells are supposed to be filled in. As the years have passed and renewed searches in various seasons have yielded no sign of Brandon, hope has dwindled that he'll ever be found. However, if there was one good thing to come out of the disappearance of Brandon Swanson, it would be Brandon's law. Brandon's parents, Brian and Annette, worked hard to get state legislators to change the laws in Minnesota. Brandon's law requires law enforcement to immediately begin investigating the disappearance of a person over 18, whereas in the past it was only children that this was done for. Brandon's law has been in effect in Minnesota since July of 2009. So, what do you think happened to Brandon Swanson in the early morning hours of May 14, 2008? Why did he think he was 25 miles away from where he really was? What caused him to swear? And whatever that was that what caused him to disappear for the next 16 years? Do you believe Brandon encountered a person that night? Or do you think whatever happened to him was the result of being exposed to the elements? Why did he leave his glasses in his car if he was legally blind in one eye? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this case, so please leave me a comment and like the video if you enjoyed this. I personally can't imagine what it would be like to be in the middle of the night, in the middle of the dark, in the rural area that he was. It would be so scary. Whatever the case may be, I wish for peace and healing for Brandon's parents, Brian, Annette, and all of his other loved ones. Thank you for watching.